Okay, so today I wanted to talk about inspection responses. And these responses I'm going to refer to are the 35R and the new response for wells, the 22RN. So when we're writing up our responses, we need to think about what the purpose of our forms are. We need to also think about what strategies we're going to use for these responses. And one of the most important things is how the wording in our responses is done so that it creates an obligation. These are times that we can use for negotiations. And if we need to, additional inspections. And with the new rules of the forms, just want to reiterate how not to waive our clients' contingency rights. So the purpose of the inspection response is to ask for repairs or concessions in lieu of those repairs. It's an opportunity to negotiate these items and create clarity with the obligations the buyer and seller agree to. Using the 22RN means we must be able to create these obligations with good faith and competence. This is as well as the 35R. We are creating these responses. Are we creating these responses in a way that asks for an action, or are we simply just listing problems? So during the course of this class, we're going to talk about how to word things in a way that gets us the results we want and make sure that we're communicating clearly with obligations set in place. So I wanted to pull up the two inspection response forms that we are now responsible for knowing. The one on the left is the well response, the 22RN, and the one on the right is the 35R. With the exception of one line, these forms are identical. So I'm talking about them together as one form because everything else other than the one line on the 35R is going to be exactly the same, and we're going to use them in the exact same way. Okay, so the first thing that's important to do is defining our words, because what we say and how we say it makes a big difference. We want to make sure we're using the word shall to create the obligation. The seller shall do this. By using the word shall, we are saying that they are obligated to or they have to do something. If we use the word such as may, we are now giving a choice to that and no longer creating a promise or an obligation. So make sure when you're wording an inspection response, you're using strong words that have this meaning. The best way to practice your wording is to attend the Draft Like a Lawyer class. So I am putting in a selfless plug for this class coming up October 11th and 12th. All right, so back to drafting. The information that I got from this entire class actually came from one of the Draft Like a Lawyer classes. So let's think about the 22RN and 35R. And the way that I want you to think about this is to cover all the bases. Technically, there's about 5 points you need to cover. The response forms, though, actually do have boilerplate language that follows up with some of these things. So when you're writing responses, make sure you cover who's obligated to do the initial work, who's going to be responsible for paying it, what work needs to be done, and who's going to actually be completing the work. Okay, so we're going to practice. Let's practice writing up, say, a roof replacement. So think about the 35R with your roof replacement. Think about how you need to answer these questions. Who's going to be obligated to initiate the work? Who will be responsible for paying? What work needs to be done? And who will be doing it? The other answers that you need to have if you don't have the 35R in place will be, when does it need to get done and what are the consequences if it doesn't? But I'm not really touching over those too much because the form itself has those built into the boilerplate. Okay, with this in mind, here are some options on how you could respond. The seller shall, that's who, at the seller's expense, who's paying, hire ABC contractor, so who's doing the work, to replace the roof. That's what work is being done. You can attach a bid to this. You could potentially change the order of these words, but the idea is to have those questions answered. You could say something like, seller shall hire ABC contractor to complete attached bid for the roof replacement at seller's expense. You're still covering all those things. The seller shall, at seller's expense, hire a licensed roofer to replace the roof with all new materials and replace flashing. You don't necessarily need to attach a bid. If there is something that needs to be done that is specific, or you want to ensure you're going to get that done, it is best to definitely attach a bid and reference that bid. When you're making the inspection response, attaching a bid to your response is not considered waiving or attaching any inspector's recommendations. So you are not risking any waiver of your inspection contingency by clarifying from a bid. What you want to avoid saying is roof needs to be replaced, or seller shall replace the roof as recommended by a licensed contractor. Even if you pull in a licensed contractor, you are now no longer saying it has to be a specific licensed contractor. You're leaving it open to interpretation from new licensed contractor. And any response you give puts the power back in the seller to decide how to best complete the action if you have not specified. Okay, so let's look at the form here. I'm going to go back to the very beginning slide where it has the whole form together really quick, because the 35R has a space on line 11. That's, I'm sorry, the line 9. I need to be able to read. Anytime now with the new form change that you are requesting additional inspections, we no longer are attaching the inspector's recommendation. We are attaching no part of any inspection. It is an opportunity that is granted to you if you have that recommendation. So the seller may, if they choose, ask for proof that the seller has truly recommended additional inspections. Going back to my last slide. Okay. If you have made back and forth negotiations, it's okay to attach additional pages. And this includes paragraph 1 or 2. If you are giving a list of repairs that need to be done and it exceeds the space allowed, go ahead and attach a blank 34 and label it Exhibit B so you can list all of the items. And sometimes it's needed for proper wording. I would rather have more pages attached than less words used. Because when we are wording our responses, we need to make sure that we are wording them so we can get our obligations set. Once a response is given, and this is for either the 22RN or the 35R, the buyer may not rescind that. They may not change their mind. They have to allow that seller time to mull it over, to think about it, and give them their 3-day response time. Keep in mind in the back of your head here that those timelines can actually change if you change them on your initial inspection form 35. So if you have labeled anything other than boilerplate, keep track of your dates. A seller cannot respond, or a seller cannot, buyer cannot, I'm sorry, I cannot talk. A buyer cannot change their mind or change their response until the seller responds. That same seller, if sending a response back to the buyer, has the same obligations to leave that buyer to their thoughts for the days allowed in the form. They cannot interfere. They cannot change their mind. The buyer gets their time to respond to their response. We do in both of these forms have what I like to call the last chance negotiation. And once a response has been given by the buyer and the seller comes back, as long as you're within your contingency timeline, which you should have those last 3 days, you can come to some sort of middle ground or an agreement and mark it in paragraph 3. Okay, question. Delivering the 35R or 22RN. The buyer delivers their 35R or 22RN, because in this case, it doesn't matter which form you're referring to, with the boxes checked for additional inspections. The inspector's recommendation is not attached. Are the 5 additional days awarded to the buyer? And does the seller have to honor this? Yes, they do. And with our recent form changes, the seller is obligated to award the additional inspection request, but the seller can require proof that those recommendations were truly given by the inspector. Okay, termination. How do you terminate based on 35R or 22RN? What if there's earnest money at escrow, or maybe there's no earnest money at escrow? Our inspection responses give us a checkbox to terminate. And the reason I'm saying this, when it seems like I probably shouldn't even say this, is the right to terminate is here with these forms. In no circumstance, if you are terminating because of these reasons, should you ever use something other than these response forms to terminate that transaction. Anytime you terminate, just make sure you're also including a Form 50 to instruct escrow on how to disperse the earnest money check. And if there's no earnest money being held, or if for some reason, the earnest money hasn't got there yet, there's no reason to include the Form 50, but make sure if there is that you do include the Form 50, and any termination on the inspection is done from the inspection response. Same with the 22RN. Now, say in this situation, the boxes below may not give you, say the boxes below have a 5-day time frame on well function and well water quality, but your document review period is 10 days. With the longer time up top, if nothing else is disapproved other than the well documents, you can actually terminate on a 90X. So if you do have a situation where you are just terminating on document review without the contingency, you can use this notice. But again, this is a notice. I'm trying to just make absolutely clear that no rescission should be signed when your client has the right to terminate. We don't need extra permission. If your client has the right, then make it a right and make it their unilateral right. So this is something that came up, and it sparks a lot of conversation, which I'm sure is going to be talked about once this class is over. What if we have multiple timelines? So in our well contingency, we have a space for 3 different timelines. We have the well document review, we have well function, and we have water quality testing. So what happens if all 3 of them have different dates? We have one addendum. How do we navigate through 3 different timelines? And are those technically 3 different contingencies? I actually did have to reach out to Annie Fitzsimmons for this because our forms are so new. So what I learned was each contingency listed has its own timeline. If there are 2 different timelines given for water quality and water quantity, each one of them are their own contingency, which means each one of them should be responded to with a separate response form. So I wanted to pull this up here so we could look at what I was talking about. Paragraph 4, if you have 15 days for water quality contingency and you have 25 days for water quantity contingency, 2 different 22 RNs need to be given at each of those due dates for those timelines. The best way to keep these separate is to start getting in the habit of writing in the biggest, boldest letters that you can on top of every single inspection response form as to what it is in response to. The similar situation will come up with the home inspection contingency. If you ask for additional time, you're using paragraph number 1 to do that. Well, when that additional time is back, you also still have your additional response time to use for paragraph 1 again. So it is possible that you could use multiple inspection responses to the same inspection. I wanted to pull them up again one more time too. Water quality, water quantity. If you're going to do one for each of them, make sure you are labeling which 22 RN it is in response to. If you want to avoid confusion for everybody, I would highly suggest keeping everything around the same contingency timeline. But if that ends up not being what happens, because we all know life happens, then make sure you are bulleting water quality for one, water quantity for the other. As a reminder, it is still required that the seller gives permission to see the inspection. So with the inspection contingency and the updated information and updated rule on additional inspections, do not send anything over without either one of these boxes checked here or one of the boxes checked on the inspection contingency itself. We don't want to waive our clients' rights unnecessarily. All right. Thank you for listening. That was a lot to take in, but I hope everybody learned something great from that. And if you have a well contingency, keep in mind, you do have the right to respond to each of those contingencies. Thank you.